Part 1. Expectations versus Reality. The morning mist clung to the sacred shores of Iona like a burial shroud. It was June 795 AD, and the Viking longships emerged from the fog like dragons breathing smoke. The Norse raiders expected what they'd found everywhere else: terrified monks, easy plunder, and perhaps a few local farmers who would flee at the first sight of Viking steel. What they found instead would haunt Norse sagas for generations. As the first Viking warriors leaped from their ships onto the Holy Island's beach, they were met not with prayers and panic, but with a wall of screaming, painted warriors. These weren't just monks defending their monastery. These were Gaelic warriors, their faces twisted in battle fury, their bodies marked with swirling blue patterns that seemed to writhe in the dim light. They charged naked from the waist up, wielding massive swords and shrieking war cries that would make a berserker's blood run cold. The Vikings had expected sheep. They found wolves. This wasn't how the story was supposed to go. From the frozen fjords of Norway to the rich monasteries of Northumbria, the Viking way of war had proven unstoppable. Their very appearance struck terror into the hearts of civilized peoples. The sight of the dragon-prowed ships, the sound of berserker howls, the clash of axes on shields, all of it was calculated to break an enemy's will before the first blow was struck. They called it the Viking Storm, and it had swept across Europe like a force of nature. In 793 AD, just 2 years earlier, they had descended upon Lindisfarne, and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded it as if the world itself was ending. Dragons were seen flying in the air, the chronicler wrote, and then came the ravaging of heathen men who miserably destroyed God's church. The formula was simple and had worked from the Baltic to the Irish Sea. Strike fast, strike hard, and above all, strike fear into your enemies' hearts. Let them know that resistance meant death, but death of the most horrible kind. Let them see the berserkers, warriors who fought in a trance-like fury, biting their shields, howling like beasts, seemingly immune to pain. Let them hear the stories of the Blood Eagle, where victims had their ribs torn from their spines and spread like wings. Let terror do half the work before battle even began. In Ireland, this strategy had worked perfectly. The annals speak of monks abandoning their monasteries at the mere rumour of Viking approach. In England, entire towns paid massive bribes, the Danegeld, just to avoid Viking attention. In Francia, Charles the Bald would eventually offer the Viking leader Rollo an entire duchy rather than continue fighting. Everywhere the Vikings went, they found that fear was their greatest weapon. Scotland, they assumed, would be no different, perhaps easier even. The Vikings knew Scotland as Alba, a land of scattered tribes and petty kingdoms. Their scouts and traders had reported a mountainous wilderness populated by primitive Picts and Gaels, people who painted themselves blue and lived in crude hill forts. Surely these barbarous peoples would crumble before the might of Norse steel and discipline. The Vikings had conquered or cowed Saxons, Franks, Slavs, and Irish. These were peoples with stone churches, written laws, and organized kingdoms. How much resistance could they expect from half-naked savages who still practiced the old ways, who worshipped in groves rather than churches, who trusted in their ancient gods and crude weapons? Is less than #0. 5# is greater than. Moreover, the Vikings believed they had advantages that would be even more pronounced in Scotland. Their longships could navigate the countless sea lochs and islands of the western coast, appearing anywhere without warning. Their superior ironworking produced weapons and armour that should easily overcome primitive Celtic arms. Their berserkers, those legendary warriors who fought in an ecstatic fury, would surely terrify these superstitious hill people into submission. They had intelligence too. Norwegian traders had been visiting Scottish shores for generations before the Viking Age began. They knew the major settlements, the wealthy monasteries, the political divisions between kingdoms. They knew that Dal Riata, the Gaelic kingdom of western Scotland, was engaged in constant warfare with the Picts to the east. A divided enemy was a defeated enemy. What the Vikings didn't understand, what they couldn't understand until it was too late, was that they were sailing into a warrior culture that made their own look almost civilized by comparison. The Gaels of Scotland weren't primitive, they were primal. Their warrior tradition stretched back over 1,000 years to the Latin culture of the Iron Age Celts, who had once made Rome itself tremble. While the Vikings had spent generations as farmers and traders, only recently taking up the sword in earnest, the Gaelic warriors had never put theirs down. The shock came immediately. As those first Vikings on Iona engaged the Gaelic defenders, they discovered an enemy unlike any they had faced. These warriors didn't fight to defend, they fought to destroy. They didn't seek to drive the Vikings off, they sought to annihilate them. Where Vikings used fear as a weapon, the Gaels seemed to feed on it, growing stronger the more terrible the battle became. The Gaelic warriors fought with a savagery that shocked even the Vikings. They would charge headlong into spear walls, impaling themselves to create gaps for their brothers behind them. They would continue fighting with mortal wounds, sometimes holding their own entrails in with one hand while swinging a sword with the other. They took heads as trophies, displaying them on spears, at their belts, above their doors. They believed that capturing an enemy's head captured his soul, his power, his essence. One surviving Norse account describes a Gaelic warrior who had his hand severed in battle. Rather than retreat, he thrust the bleeding stump into a pot of boiling pitch to cauterize it, picked up his sword with his remaining hand, and returned to the fight laughing. The saga says the Vikings knew then they fought not men but demons. This was guilt, the battle madness of the Gaels, and it was every bit the equal of the Viking berserker rage. But where the berserker fought in an uncontrolled fury, biting shields and howling like animals, the Gaelic warriors' madness was focused, almost joyful. They sang as they fought. They composed poetry in the midst of battle, taunting their enemies with elaborate insults that questioned their manhood, their ancestry, and their courage. The psychological impact on the Vikings was immediate and profound. These were meant to be easy targets, primitive peoples, to be scattered like chaff before the wind. Instead, the Norsemen found themselves facing warriors who not only matched their ferocity, but exceeded it. Warriors who seemed to welcome death, who laughed at pain, who treated battle not as a means to an end, but as an end in itself. The Vikings had a word, drenga, meaning a brave warrior who faced death without fear. They prided themselves on this concept, built their entire warrior culture around it. But the Gaels took this concept and amplified it to a degree that even the Vikings found unsettling. Where a Viking warrior might face death bravely, a Gaelic warrior seemed to court it, to romance it, to dance with it like a lover. This revelation came not gradually, but immediately in those first savage encounters on beaches and in glens where Viking raiding parties met Gaelic defenders. The Norse sagas, usually so boastful of Viking victories, speak of these encounters in hushed, almost fearful tones. They describe warriors who would not yield, could not be broken, and who seemed to grow stronger the more desperate the battle became. One particular account, preserved in the later medieval manuscript known as the Kogad Geidhel Re Galev, describes a Viking raid on a Gaelic settlement in what is now Argyll. The Vikings, a force of perhaps 200 warriors, expected to overwhelm the local population quickly. Instead, they were met by a force of Gaelic warriors, significantly smaller in number, perhaps 60 or 70 men. The battle should have been a Norse victory. They had superior numbers, better armour, and the element of surprise. But the Gaelic warriors did something unprecedented. Rather than form a defensive line or retreat to fortifications, they stripped naked, painted their bodies with woad and blood, and charged directly at the Viking lines while shrieking what the Norse described as the screams of the damned. The psychological impact was devastating. Vikings who had faced Saxon shield walls and Frankish cavalry were suddenly confronted by naked, painted warriors who showed no fear of death. The Gaelic charge broke the Viking line not through superior tactics, but through sheer, unrestrained violence. They fought with a fury that the Vikings, even with their berserkers, couldn't match. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect for the Vikings was the Gaelic attitude toward death and the afterlife. The Vikings believed in Valhalla, where brave warriors who died in battle would feast and fight for eternity. It was a warrior's paradise, but one that still required dying to achieve. The Gaels, however, seemed to believe that a glorious death in battle was not just a path to the afterlife, but a transformation into something greater in this life. They had a concept called ferg, a warrior's fury that was both feared and revered. When a warrior entered this state, he was believed to be possessed by the spirits of ancient heroes, to become something more than human. The Vikings had their berserkers, men who fought in an animal fury. But the Gaels had warriors who fought with what they believed was divine possession, men who became avatars of war gods, like Cuchulainn, the legendary hero who had defended Ulster single-handedly against entire armies. The Vikings were also unprepared for the Gaelic concept of honour and shame. In Norse culture, there was no shame in strategic withdrawal. A wise Viking leader knew when to fight and when to retreat, when to raid and when to negotiate, but for the Gaelic warrior, retreat was worse than death. Their poets, the Philid, were present at every battle, composing verses that would immortalize the brave and condemn the cowardly for all time. To flee from battle was to ensure that your name would be cursed for generations. This created a dynamic the Vikings had never encountered. Usually, when a battle turned against defenders, they would break and run, allowing the Vikings to cut them down from behind. But Gaelic warriors didn't run. They stood and died where they fought, taking as many enemies with them as possible. Every battle became a fight to the death, something that even the Vikings, for all their warrior culture, found exhausting and demoralizing. The Norse had expected to find primitive peoples awed by Viking might. Instead, they found a warrior culture that had been honing its skills for over a millennium. Where Vikings had a few generations of raiding experience, the Gaels had centuries of constant warfare, brother against brother, clan against clan, kingdom against kingdom. War wasn't something they did, it was who they were. Part 2. The Defenders' Unique Advantages. The wind howled through Glencoe like the voices of the ancient dead, carrying with it the sound of pipes and war drums. In this harsh landscape of towering peaks and dark valleys, the Vikings discovered they weren't just fighting men, they were fighting a land, a culture, and a way of life that had been forged in blood over millennia. To understand why the Scottish Gaels proved such formidable opponents, we must first understand who they were before the first Viking longship ever touched their shores. These weren't scattered barbarians living in primitive squalor, as the Vikings had assumed. They were the inheritors of an ancient warrior tradition that stretched back to the Iron Age, when Celtic warriors had sacked Rome itself in 390 BC and carved out kingdoms from Anatolia to Iberia. The Gaelic warrior culture was built around the concept of the fianna, warrior bands that existed outside normal society. These weren't merely soldiers or guards. They were warrior mystics, poet-fighters, men who lived for battle and died for glory. The fianna traced their traditions back to mythical heroes like Finn mac Cumhaill, whose warrior band was said to have defended Ireland and Scotland from supernatural threats in the distant past. To join a fianna, a young man had to undergo trials that would break most modern special forces soldiers. He had to stand in a hole up to his waist and defend himself against 9 warriors, throwing spears at him, armed only with a shield and a hazel stick. He had to run through the forest pursued by the entire band without breaking a single twig underfoot or disturbing his braided hair. He had to leap over a branch, the height of his forehead, and pass under one the height of his knee without breaking stride. He had to pull a thorn from his foot while running without slowing down. These weren't just physical tests. They were spiritual transformations. The warrior who emerged from these trials was no longer quite human in the eyes of his society. He existed in a liminal space between the mortal world and the other world, between civilization and wilderness, between man and beast. This is crucial to understanding why Vikings found them so unsettling. The Norse had their own warrior traditions, but they still saw themselves as men. The Gaelic warriors had deliberately transformed themselves into something else. The training began in childhood. From the age of 7, boys destined for the warrior path were sent away from their mothers to be fostered by other clans. This practice, called altrum, served multiple purposes. It created bonds between clans, ensuring a network of alliances, but more importantly for our story, it hardened children to violence and separation from an early age. They learned to fight not for their immediate family, but for abstract concepts of honor and glory. By the age of 14, these boys were expected to take their first heads in cattle raids. By 17, they had to have killed enemies in formal battle. Those who showed exceptional promise might be invited to join a fianna, but even those who didn't became part of the general warrior culture that permeated Gaelic society. Every free man was expected to be competent with weapons. Every gathering was an opportunity to demonstrate martial prowess. The Highland games, which tourists today watch as quaint cultural exhibitions, were actually military training exercises. The caber toss developed the explosive strength needed to overturn enemy fortifications. The hammer throw built the muscles used in swinging the massive claymore swords. The stone put enhanced the power needed to hurl boulders down on enemies from mountainsides. What looked like sport was actually preparation for war. But the physical conditioning went beyond formal training. Life in the Scottish Highlands was itself a form of warrior preparation. The diet consisted primarily of oatmeal, which could be carried dry and mixed with water or blood for instant sustenance on campaign. They supplemented this with wild game, particularly venison, which required extensive hunting through treacherous terrain. The constant climbing of mountains, fording of icy streams, and surviving in some of Europe's harshest weather created a baseline of physical toughness that Vikings, coming from the relatively gentler climate of southern Scandinavia, found hard to match. The Gaels also practiced deliberate hardening rituals that bordered on the masochistic. Warriors would stand naked in freezing streams, reciting epic poems until they could no longer speak. They would fast for days before battle, believing that hunger sharpened their killing instinct. They would sleep on beds of stone to accustom their bodies to discomfort. Some warrior bands practiced scarification, cutting patterns into their skin that would form raised keloid scars, both as a form of spiritual protection and as a way to become accustomed to the pain of blade wounds. This physical conditioning was matched by psychological preparation that created warriors of unusual mental resilience. The concept of guilt, which we touched on earlier, wasn't just battle madness. It was a cultivated state of consciousness that warriors trained to enter at will. Through a combination of ritual practices, including sensory deprivation, psychoactive substances derived from mushrooms and herbs, and repetitive chanting, warriors learned to access altered states of consciousness that made them seemingly immune to fear and pain. The role of the poets, the Philid, in this psychological conditioning cannot be overstated. These weren't mere entertainers or record keepers. They were combination psychologists, propagandists, and spiritual guides who shaped the warrior mindset from childhood. They told stories of heroes who fought against impossible odds, who laughed at death, who achieved immortality through glorious defeat. Every Gaelic warrior grew up knowing that the Philid were watching, ready to compose verses that would either immortalize their bravery or condemn their cowardice for all time. This created a psychological framework where death in battle wasn't just acceptable, it was desirable. But not just any death, it had to be a worthy death, a death that would make a good story, a death that would inspire future generations. This is why Gaelic warriors would perform seemingly insane acts of bravery, charging alone into enemy formations or fighting on with mortal wounds. They weren't just fighting the enemy in front of them, they were performing for history itself. The weapons and tactics of the Gaelic warriors were perfectly evolved for their environment and fighting style. The claymore, the great sword of the Highlands, was a weapon that required immense strength to wield effectively. Unlike the Viking sword, which was designed for versatility in shield wall fighting, the claymore was designed for one purpose: devastating offensive power. In the hands of a charging Gaelic warrior, it could cleave through shield, armour, and bone in a single strike. But the claymore was just one part of the Gaelic arsenal. They carried dirks, long daggers that were effective in the close-quarters combat that inevitably followed the initial charge. The C and dub, the black knife, was concealed in their clothing or boots, a last resort weapon that could turn defeat into mutual destruction. They used axes similar to but distinct from Viking designs, with longer handles that gave them reach advantage in single combat. The Highland charge itself was a tactic that turned every supposed disadvantage into an advantage. The Vikings expected organised shield walls, the standard military formation of the age. Instead, they faced what appeared to be a disorganised mob of screaming warriors charging downhill at them. But this apparent chaos was actually a sophisticated tactic. Each warrior picked his target during the charge, aiming for gaps in the shield wall or warriors who showed signs of fear. The charge was timed to hit just as the enemy was still forming up, before defensive formations could solidify. The Gaels also mastered the false retreat, a tactic that played on Viking aggression. They would charge, engage briefly, then suddenly break and run. The Vikings, trained to exploit any sign of weakness, would pursue, only to find themselves strung out and separated as the fleeing Gaels turned and counterattacked. In the broken terrain of the Highlands, with its hidden ravines and sudden cliffs, this tactic was devastatingly effective. But perhaps the most significant tactical advantage the Gaels possessed was their intimate knowledge of their homeland's terrain. Every glen had its ambush points, every loch its hidden shallows, every mountain its secret paths. They knew where morning mist would conceal movement, where echoes would multiply the sound of their war cries, where narrow passes would neutralize Viking numerical advantages. They employed what would today be called guerrilla warfare, but with a sophistication that wouldn't be seen again in Europe until the Peninsular War 1,000 years later. They would poison wells along Viking advance routes. They would drive cattle into Viking camps at night to cause chaos. They would pick off sentries and scouts, leaving their mutilated bodies where their comrades would find them. Every Viking step into the Highlands was a step into hostile territory where the very landscape seemed to fight against them. The development of the Norse-Gael hybrid warriors represented an evolution that even the Vikings hadn't anticipated. When Norse raiders began settling in the Hebrides and western Scotland in the mid-900s AD, intermarrying with the local population, they created something new and terrifying. Warriors who combined Viking seamanship and ironworking with Gaelic ferocity and local knowledge. The most famous of these Norse-Gaels was Somerleld, who lived in the 1200s AD. His very name tells the story of this cultural fusion. Somerleld comes from the Old Norse Sumerliði, meaning summer traveller, a Viking name. But he fought in the Gaelic style, led Gaelic warriors, and eventually carved out a kingdom that successfully resisted both Norwegian and Scottish royal power. Somerleld's warriors represented the ultimate synthesis of Viking and Gaelic military traditions. They had the Viking mastery of naval warfare, able to strike anywhere along the coast with their berlins, vessels that combined the best features of Viking longships and Gaelic galleys. But when they came ashore, they fought with the unrestrained violence of their Gaelic heritage. They knew every hiding place in the islands, every current in the sea channels, every defensive position in the mountains. These Norse-Gaels developed new weapons that combined both traditions. They created axes with longer handles than Viking battle axes, but shorter than Gaelic polearms, perfect for both shipboard combat and Highland charges. They wore mail armour like Vikings, but modified it to allow for the greater mobility demanded by Gaelic tactics. They used Viking-style shields, but painted them with Gaelic symbols that were believed to provide supernatural protection. The Galloglass warriors were perhaps the ultimate expression of this fusion. The name comes from the Gaelic Galloglai, meaning foreign warriors, but by the 1300s AD, they had become a distinct warrior class. These were professional soldiers who combined the disciplined formation fighting of the Vikings with the individual combat prowess of the Gaels. They wore heavy armour but could still execute the Highland charge. They used massive two-handed axes that required Viking-style strength but employed them with Gaelic fury. The Galloglass were so effective that they were recruited as mercenaries throughout the British Isles and beyond. English chroniclers described them with a mixture of awe and terror, noting that they seemed to feel no pain and would continue fighting even when mortally wounded. One account describes a Galloglass warrior who had been run through with a spear continuing to advance up the shaft to kill his opponent before dying himself. But what made the Norse-Gaels truly formidable was their cultural adaptability. They could switch between Viking and Gaelic modes of warfare depending on the situation. Against Viking raiders, they would use their knowledge of Norse tactics to anticipate and counter Viking strategies. Against Gaelic enemies, they would employ Viking discipline and technology. They were shapeshifters of war, impossible to predict or counter. The psychological impact of the Norse-Gaels on pure Viking forces was particularly pronounced. Here were men who looked like Vikings, who spoke Norse, who understood Viking culture, but who fought with an un-Viking-like savagery. They represented a kind of warrior the Vikings had never imagined themselves, but worse. They were the Viking nightmare made flesh, their own strengths turned against them and amplified by an even more violent warrior tradition. Part 3. The Turning Point. The storm came out of nowhere, as Highland storms do, turning the Firth of Clyde into a maelstrom of wind and wave. It was October 2nd, 1063 AD, and King Haakon IV of Norway watched from his flagship as his mighty invasion fleet, the largest Norse force ever assembled against Scotland, was torn apart by weather that seemed summoned by the land itself. The Scots would later say their prayers had been answered. The Vikings would say they had been cursed. Both were probably right. Haakon had come to Scotland with overwhelming force and absolute confidence. At 60 years old, he was one of the most experienced warrior kings in Europe, ruler of a Norse empire that stretched from Greenland to the Isle of Man. His fleet numbered over 120 ships, carrying perhaps 15,000 warriors, including his own royal herd, the elite household troops, and contingents from Norway, Orkney, Shetland, and the Hebrides. This wasn't a raid, it was a conquest, intended to finally bring the rebellious Scottish kingdom to heel and re-establish Norse dominance over the western seaboard of Scotland. The expedition had begun well enough. The fleet had sailed from Bergen in July, gathering forces as it moved through Norse territories. In Orkney, local jarls joined with their warriors. In the Hebrides, Norse-Gael lords added their Berlins to the fleet. By the time Haakon's armada rounded the Mull of Kintyre, it was a force that should have been unstoppable. The young Scottish king, Alexander III, had watched this gathering storm with what the Vikings interpreted as fear. He sent envoys to negotiate, offering concessions, trying to buy time. The Norse took this as weakness. They had seen this pattern before in England, in Ireland, in Francia. First came negotiation, then capitulation, then conquest. What they didn't realise was that Alexander was playing a different game entirely. Every day of negotiation was another day closer to autumn, when the Scottish weather would become their ally. The Scots had learned from generations of Viking raids. They knew Norse weaknesses as well as strengths. Viking military dominance depended on mobility, on the ability to strike quickly and withdraw before organized resistance could form. But a fleet of over 100 ships couldn't move quickly. An army of 15,000 men needed supplies that couldn't be easily gathered from the hostile Scottish countryside. Most importantly, Viking ships, for all their seaworthiness, were vulnerable to the autumn storms that regularly ravaged Scotland's western coast. When negotiations finally broke down in late September, Haakon ordered his forces to land and ravage the countryside around Largs, a small settlement on the Ayrshire coast. It should have been a simple demonstration of Viking power, a show of force to bring Alexander to terms. Instead, it became the graveyard of Norse ambitions in Scotland. The storm struck on September 30th, but this was just the beginning. For 2 days, hurricane-force winds battered the Norse fleet. Ships dragged their anchors and were driven onto the rocky shore. Others collided in the chaos, their crews desperately trying to maintain position in the narrow waters between the mainland and the Isle of Bute. The flagship's own anchor cable snapped, and only the skill of Haakon's sailors prevented the king himself from being dashed on the rocks. By the morning of October 2nd, 5 longships had been beached, their crews struggling to salvage what they could. Perhaps 500 warriors were on the shore, exhausted from fighting the storm, trying to organize a defense of their stranded vessels. It was then that the Scots appeared. Alexander had been waiting, watching, gathering his forces while the storm did its work. Now, he struck with timing that showed he understood Viking psychology as well as they understood his. The Norse were warriors of the sea. On land, especially exhausted, demoralized land, they were vulnerable. The Scottish force that descended on Largs Beach wasn't huge, perhaps 2,000 men, but they were fresh, they were organized, and they were led by Alexander himself, along with his best commanders. What happened next shattered Viking confidence forever. The initial Scottish attack was repulsed, the Norse forming a desperate shield wall on the beach. But then came something the Vikings hadn't expected, the Highland charge. Gaelic warriors from the Scottish host, many of them from Argyll and the Western Highlands, stripped off their armour and charged naked down the beach, screaming in Gaelic, wielding their massive claymores. The psychological impact was devastating. These weren't the negotiating, temporizing Scots the Vikings thought they knew. These were the wild men their grandfathers had warned them about, the warriors who had turned the Hebrides into a death trap for so many Norse raiders. The Viking shield wall, already weakened by exhaustion, and the piecemeal arrival of reinforcements from the ships, began to buckle. A Norse saga describes what happened next with unusual honesty. The Scots fought with a fury we had not seen since the old days. They cared nothing for wounds, nothing for death. A man of theirs, struck through with a spear, pulled himself along its length to strike down the man who held it. Another, his sword arm severed, took up his blade in his shield hand and fought on. They were not like men but like beasts, or demons, or the walking dead. The battle raged for hours, spreading from the beach to the hills above. Viking reinforcements struggled to land through the continuing storm, arriving in small groups that were overwhelmed by the Scots before they could form up. The elite Norwegian herd, Haakon's personal guard, fought with desperate courage, but even they were pushed back step by step. The turning point came when a group of Highland warriors broke through to where Haakon's banner flew. The king himself, too old and ill to fight, had remained on his ship, but his standard-bearer and royal guards were on the beach. The Highlanders, recognizing the importance of their target, fought with redoubled fury. The standard-bearer fell, the golden banner of Norway, trampled in the bloody sand. For the Vikings, this wasn't just a tactical defeat, it was a spiritual catastrophe. By nightfall, the beach was a charnel house. Viking dead lay in heaps, their blood mixing with the rain and seawater. The survivors had managed to withdraw to their remaining ships, but they left behind not just their dead, but their reputation for invincibility. The mighty Viking army that had come to conquer Scotland had been broken by a force a fraction of its size. But Largs was just the most dramatic of many turning points. Throughout the Highlands and Islands, similar scenes had been playing out for decades, moments when Viking confidence turned to fear, when the hunters became the hunted. Take the case of Ketil Flatnose, a Norwegian jarl who attempted to establish a Viking kingdom in the Hebrides in the late 800s AD. He arrived with 5 longships and 300 warriors, expecting to cow the local population into submission. Instead, he found himself in a nightmare of constant guerrilla warfare. His men couldn't leave their fortified camps without being ambushed. Sentries disappeared in the night, their heads later found mounted on spears. Food supplies were poisoned, water sources fouled with dead animals. The psychological pressure broke Ketil's men before Gaelic swords did. Vikings started deserting, something almost unheard of in Norse military culture. Others refused to stand watch alone. Some claimed to see ghostly warriors in the mist, the spirits of ancient Gaelic heroes come to defend their land. Within 2 years, Ketil abandoned his attempt at conquest, sailing away with less than half the men he had brought. The sagas say he never spoke of what happened in the Hebrides. Or consider the fate of Thorstein the Red, who attempted to conquer parts of Scotland in the late 900s AD. He won initial victories, using traditional Viking tactics of rapid movement and overwhelming force. But as he pushed deeper into Gaelic territory, the nature of warfare changed. His enemies stopped meeting him in open battle. Instead, they melted into the landscape, striking from ambush, killing stragglers, destroying supplies. The end came in Caithness, where Thorstein thought he had finally cornered a Gaelic force in a glen. He led his warriors in, confident of victory, but it was a trap. The Gaels had chosen their ground carefully, a narrow valley where Viking numbers meant nothing. As the Norse advanced, warriors appeared on the heights above, raining down boulders and arrows. The retreat became a rout, then a massacre. Thorstein himself was run down and killed, his head taken as a trophy. His army simply ceased to exist. These weren't isolated incidents, but part of a pattern that repeated across Scotland wherever Vikings attempted to move from raiding to conquest. The role of terrain in these defeats cannot be overstated. Scotland's landscape seemed designed by the gods to frustrate Viking military doctrine. The mountains created a maze of valleys and glens where large forces could be easily ambushed. The numerous sea locks that initially seemed to favour Viking naval mobility became traps when local forces controlled the heights above them. The Great Glen, that massive geological fault that split Scotland from coast to coast, became particularly notorious among Viking raiders. It should have been a highway for conquest, allowing Norse forces to move from the western seas to the eastern lands. Instead, it became a killing ground. Every narrow pass could hide an ambush. Every loch crossing was overlooked by hills from which defenders could strike. The weather itself seemed to fight against the invaders, with mists that concealed Gaelic movements and storms that struck with uncanny timing. Viking military success had always depended on intelligence, on knowing where wealth was concentrated, where defences were weak, where political divisions could be exploited. But in the Highlands, this intelligence network broke down. The Gaels had a saying, "The wind carries news to those who know how to listen." Every Viking movement was observed and reported through a network of signals and runners that the Norse never fully understood. Beacon fires on hilltops could transmit information across vast distances faster than any Viking scout could travel. The psychological impact of this constant surveillance was profound. Vikings were used to being the ones who struck from nowhere, who appeared without warning. In Scotland, they found themselves always watched, always anticipated. Raiders would arrive at a monastery, to find it already evacuated, its treasures hidden. War bands would march to attack a settlement, only to find it deserted, then suffer ambush on the return journey. But perhaps the most profound turning points were cultural, moments when Vikings encountered aspects of Gaelic warrior culture that shattered their own worldview. The Norse had always prided themselves on being the most fearsome warriors in Europe. Their entire identity was built on this reputation. To find enemies who not only matched but exceeded their capacity for violence was deeply disturbing. The Gaelic practice of head-taking particularly unnerved the Vikings. The Norse certainly mutilated enemies, the blood eagle being the most famous example, but this was usually done for specific ritual or political purposes. The Gaels took heads as a matter of course, collecting them like trophies. They believed that the head contained the soul, and that taking an enemy's head gave you power over his spirit. Warriors would carry preserved heads at their belts, display them at feasts, even talk to them as if they were still alive. One Norse account describes a Viking raiding party discovering a Gaelic warrior's hall decorated with hundreds of skulls, each one polished and positioned with care. The chronicler writes, "We who thought ourselves wolves found we had entered the lair of something worse than wolves. We left that place and never returned." The Gaelic attitude toward berserkers was another cultural shock. Vikings used their berserkers as psychological weapons, sending them forward to break enemy morale with their apparent madness and immunity to pain. But the Gaels saw berserkers not as terrifying super warriors, but as men who had lost control, who had abandoned skill for fury. Gaelic champions would specifically seek out berserkers in battle, viewing them as worthy opponents whose defeat would bring great honour. There are multiple accounts of formal single combats where Gaelic champions faced Viking berserkers. The berserker would work himself into his fury, biting his shield, howling like a beast, charging forward in an unstoppable rage. The Gaelic warrior would remain calm, almost amused, waiting for the moment when fury made his opponent careless. Then, with a single precise strike, the berserker would fall. The psychological impact on watching Vikings was severe. Their ultimate warriors, the men who were supposed to be invincible in their rage, were being defeated by enemies who treated them like rabid dogs to be put down. The Vikings also discovered that their usual tactics of intimidation simply didn't work on the Gaels. Threats of the blood eagle, of burning halls with families inside, of enslaving women and children, all the horrors that usually brought quick surrender from other peoples, only seemed to make the Gaels fight harder. They had their own traditions of ritualized cruelty that made Viking threats seem almost mundane. Part 4. The Aftermath. The old Skald sat silent by the fire in Trondheim, his weathered hands wrapped around a horn of mead. Young warriors had asked him to tell of the great raids, of Viking glory in distant lands. But when they mentioned Scotland, his eyes grew distant and his voice dropped to barely a whisper. "There are lands where even the bravest fear to tread," he said, "where the mountains have eyes and the mist has teeth, where men paint themselves with the blood of their enemies and laugh as they die. We call them the warriors of Alba, and we do not speak of them lightly." This scene, recorded in a 13th century Icelandic manuscript, captures something profound about how Viking defeats in Scotland rippled through Norse culture. The sagas, usually so boastful about Viking victories, treat Scotland with unusual caution. When they speak of Alba, the Gaelic lands, they use terms normally reserved for supernatural threats. The warriors there aren't just fierce, they're touched by dark gods. The land itself isn't just hostile, it's cursed ground where Norse blood waters foreign soil. The impact went beyond mere stories. By the late 1100s AD, Viking raiding patterns had shifted dramatically. Where once Norse ships had ranged freely along Scotland's western coast, they now avoided large sections entirely. The Sea of the Hebrides, which should have been a Viking highway, became known as the grave of Longships. Young Norwegian nobles, seeking reputation and wealth, were actively discouraged from raiding in Scotland. Seek your fortune in England or Ireland, the old warriors would advise, but leave the Scots to their mountains. This wasn't cowardice, but pragmatism born from bitter experience. The Vikings had learned that Scotland offered a uniquely poor risk-to-reward ratio. The potential plunder was relatively modest compared to the rich monasteries of Ireland or the wealthy towns of England. But the cost in lives was astronomical. A raid that might yield a handful of silver and some cattle could cost dozens of warriors, men whose training represented years of investment by their communities. The economic impact of these losses has been underestimated by historians focused on Viking successes elsewhere. Every dead warrior represented not just a military loss, but an economic catastrophe for Norse communities. These were men in their prime, who should have been leading raids, conducting trade, and producing children for another 20 years. When they died on Scottish beaches or in Highland glens, entire family lines ended, farms went unworked, and ships went unmanned. The Orkney-Inga saga, written in the early 1300s AD, provides a fascinating window into how Norse settlers in Scotland itself viewed their Gaelic neighbours. Despite controlling Orkney and Shetland for centuries, the Norse earls there speak of the Scottish mainland with consistent wariness. They describe elaborate precautions taken when dealing with Gaelic lords, never meeting without massive armed escorts, never trusting Gaelic safe conducts, always having escape routes planned. This from Vikings who supposedly dominated the region. Earl Rogvald Cully Colson, who ruled Orkney in the 1100s AD, left particularly telling instructions to his successors. He warned them to never pursue Scots into the mountains, never trust a Gael who claims friendship, and never, ever, underestimate their capacity for violence. This from a man who had crusaded in the Holy Land and fought across Europe, yet found the Scottish Gaels uniquely dangerous. The long-term consequences of Viking failures in Scotland reshaped the political landscape of the British Isles. Instead of a Norse kingdom stretching from Shetland to the Isle of Man, as Viking leaders had envisioned, Scotland emerged as a unified kingdom capable of resisting not just Norse, but also English expansion. The confidence gained from defeating Viking invasions became part of Scottish national identity, a martial pride that would influence Scottish history for centuries. The Kingdom of the Isles, which emerged in the 1100s AD, represented not Viking conquest but Norse-Gael synthesis. Leaders like Somerled didn't see themselves as Vikings ruling over Gaels or Gaels who had adopted Viking ways. They were something new, combining the maritime expertise of the Norse with the warrior traditions of the Gaels. Their existence was living proof that Vikings hadn't conquered Scotland, they had been absorbed by it. The Lordship of the Isles, which succeeded the Kingdom of the Isles, continued this tradition well into the 1500s AD. These lords commanded fleets that could challenge Scottish and English royal power, yet they did so using Gaelic law, speaking Gaelic, and following Gaelic customs. The Vikings hadn't imposed their culture on Western Scotland. They had been subsumed into Gaelic culture, contributing their seamanship and ironworking while adopting Gaelic language, law, and identity. The archaeological evidence for Viking defeats in Scotland is compelling but often overlooked. At sites across the Highlands and Islands, excavations have revealed Norse burials that tell stories of violence and defeat rather than conquest and settlement. At Ardnamurchan, a Viking boat burial from the 1000s AD contains a warrior buried with a full complement of weapons, suggesting death in battle rather than peaceful settlement. The isotope analysis of his teeth indicates he grew up in Norway but died far from home, his grave goods mixed with local artifacts suggesting hasty burial by enemies who nonetheless respected warrior tradition. At numerous sites in the Hebrides, Viking Age layers show evidence of burning and destruction, but not the pattern expected from Viking raids. Instead, the archaeology suggests Norse settlements being overrun and destroyed by local forces. At Bornes on South Uist, a Viking trading post was systematically demolished, its timbers burned, its trade goods scattered. This wasn't random violence, but deliberate erasure of Norse presence. The distribution of Viking silver hoards in Scotland tells another story of defeat. These buried treasures, hidden by Vikings who never returned to retrieve them, cluster along escape routes from the Highland interior to the coast. They represent not successful raiders burying loot for safekeeping, but desperate warriors caching their wealth as they fled, hoping to return but never making it. The Galloway hoard, discovered in 2014 AD, contained not just silver but personal religious items, suggesting Vikings under such pressure they buried even their most sacred possessions. Perhaps most telling are the weapon finds. Across Scotland, archaeologists have found Viking swords, axes, and spearheads, but often in contexts suggesting battlefield losses rather than burial goods. In peat bogs and river crossings, at the base of cliffs and in mountain passes, Norse weapons lie where they were lost in combat or flight. The distribution patterns map retreat routes and last stands, military disasters written in metal across the Scottish landscape. The skeletal evidence is equally revealing. At sites like Port Mahomac on the Tarbat Peninsula, excavations have revealed victims of Viking raids, but also Vikings who met violent ends. One skeleton, identified as Norse by isotope analysis and associated grave goods, shows massive trauma from a bladed weapon, likely a claymore, that nearly severed the body in two. Another shows defensive wounds on arms and hands before a killing blow to the skull, evidence of a desperate last fight against an overwhelming opponent. The linguistic evidence provides another layer to this story of Norse failure. In areas of England under extended Viking control, Norse words entered the language by the hundreds. Common English words like knife, skill, skull, anger, and husband all come from Old Norse. But in Gaelic-speaking Scotland, Norse linguistic influence is largely confined to place names, particularly in coastal areas and islands. The language of daily life remained overwhelmingly Gaelic, suggesting that Norse cultural influence never penetrated beyond superficial control of certain maritime zones. Even in place names, the pattern is telling. Norse names cluster in Orkney, Shetland, and parts of the Hebrides, but thin out dramatically as one moves inland. The mountains remained linguistically Gaelic, their passes and peaks bearing the names given by Celtic peoples 1,000 years before the Vikings arrived. This linguistic frontier marks the limit of Norse influence, a high water mark they could never exceed. The legacy of Viking defeats in Scotland extends far beyond the medieval period. The fierce resistance of the Scottish Gaels became part of European legend, influencing how Scotland was perceived by potential invaders for centuries. When Edward I of England attempted to conquer Scotland in the late 1200s AD, his chroniclers explicitly referenced Viking failures as a warning. When Henry VIII contemplated renewed invasion in the 1500s AD, his advisors cited the fate of Norse armies in the Highlands. The Galloglass, those Norse-Gael hybrid warriors, became one of medieval Europe's most sought-after mercenary forces. They served in Ireland for centuries, their reputation built on the fusion of Viking and Gaelic military traditions. English chronicles describe them with awe and fear, noting their unusual combination of disciplined formation, fighting, and berserk individual combat. They were living proof that the Viking-Gael synthesis had created something more formidable than either tradition alone. The story of Viking defeats in Scotland challenges our fundamental understanding of the Viking Age. Popular culture presents Vikings as unstoppable raiders who dominated wherever they went, imposing their will through superior military might. But Scotland tells a different story, one where the Vikings met their match and more, where their vaunted berserkers were cut down by warriors who fought with equal or greater fury, where their longships became death traps in narrow sea lochs, where their dreams of conquest died in Highland snow. This has been largely erased from popular memory, replaced by a simplified narrative of Viking dominance, but the historical record is clear. Scotland was where Viking expansion stopped, where Norse ambitions were broken, where the unstoppable force met the truly immovable object. The Gaelic warriors who achieved this deserve recognition alongside the more famous resistors of Viking expansion like Alfred the Great or Brian Boru. The lessons from this forgotten history remain relevant. It shows that military technology and tactics, no matter how advanced, can be negated by determined resistance and intimate knowledge of terrain. It demonstrates that warrior cultures, when they clash, don't always result in the dominance of one over the other, but sometimes create synthesis more powerful than either original. It proves that the will to resist, when combined with effective military tradition, can overcome seemingly overwhelming odds. Modern Scottish military tradition still carries echoes of this ancient resistance. The Highland regiments that served the British Empire with such distinction traced their heritage back to the warriors who had stood against the Vikings. Their regimental mottos, their pipe music, their fierce pride, all connected them to ancestors who had made even berserkers afraid. When a Highland regiment charged at Waterloo or the Somme, they carried with them the ghost of that Gaelic fury that had broken Viking ambitions 1,000 years before. The archaeological work continues, each season bringing new evidence of Viking-Gael interaction. Recent DNA studies of Scottish populations show surprisingly little Norse genetic influence outside of the Northern Isles, suggesting that Viking settlement was far more limited than their initial military impact might suggest. The Gaels had not just resisted Viking conquest, they had largely prevented Viking colonization. Conclusion: the mist still rises from Scottish glens in the early morning, just as it did over 1,000 years ago when Viking raiders learned that some lands cannot be conquered, only survived. Stand on the shores of Iona today, where tourists photograph the restored abbey, and you stand where Norse warriors discovered that their reputation for invincibility was just that, a reputation, one that could be shattered by warriors who fought with even greater fury than their own. We live in an age saturated with Viking imagery. Television shows depict Norse warriors as unstoppable forces of nature, cutting through enemies like wheat before the scythe. Video games let us play as Viking raiders, conquering our way across medieval Europe. Museums display Viking swords and axes as symbols of military dominance. The horned helmet, historically inaccurate though it may be, has become visual shorthand for warrior prowess. But this popular narrative commits a grave historical injustice. It erases the stories of those who stood against the Viking storm and won. It forgets that, for every monastery burned, there were others defended. For every kingdom that paid Danegeld, there were others that paid in blood, their own and their enemies, to remain free. And nowhere was this resistance more fierce, more successful, or more forgotten than in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland. The truth is that berserker rage was not always enough. The Vikings discovered in Scotland that there existed warriors whose capacity for violence matched and exceeded their own. The Gaels didn't just resist Viking expansion, they traumatized Viking culture to such an extent that Norse sagas speak of Scottish warriors the way they usually spoke of monsters and supernatural threats. When the most feared warriors in European history speak of you with fear, you have achieved something remarkable. The modern implications of this historical reality extend beyond mere academic correction. In an era where we study asymmetric warfare in military academies, the Scottish resistance to Viking invasion provides a masterclass that predates modern terminology by a millennium. The Gaels demonstrated that superior technology and tactics can be negated by intimate knowledge of terrain, that psychological warfare can break enemies before physical combat begins, and that the will to resist, properly channeled through effective military tradition, can overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. The power of defending homeland versus raiding for profit created a motivation gap that all the berserker fury in the world couldn't bridge. Vikings fought for wealth and glory, Gaels fought for survival and identity. Vikings could always retreat to their ships and sail away. Gaels had nowhere to retreat to. This fundamental difference in stakes gave defenders an edge that military historians have recognized in conflicts from ancient times to modern insurgencies. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of this story is how warrior cultures clash and merge. The Vikings didn't simply fail in Scotland, they were absorbed and transformed. The Norse-Gael synthesis created warriors like the Galloglass, who combined the most fearsome aspects of both traditions. This wasn't conquest or resistance, but something more complex, cultural fusion through conflict, creating something greater than the sum of its parts. The importance of complete historical narratives cannot be overstated. When we tell only one side of history, we don't just disservice the past, we impoverish our understanding of human complexity. The Vikings were extraordinary warriors and seafarers who reshaped European history. But they were also human beings who could be defeated, who could feel fear, who could meet their match. Acknowledging this doesn't diminish their achievements. It makes them more real, more human, more interesting. The irony is exquisite when fully appreciated. The Vikings, who burst out of Scandinavia to terrorize civilized Europe, met their match in what they considered the barbarian fringe of the known world. They who had made kings tremble and emperors negotiate were brought low by half-naked warriors from misty mountains. They who had perfected the art of psychological warfare through terror found themselves terrified by enemies who seemed to welcome death with open arms. The Scottish Gaels earned something that few peoples in history have achieved: the respect, born from fear, of the Vikings. This wasn't respect granted grudgingly after negotiation or accommodation. This was respect carved out with claymore and dirk, written in blood on Highland heather, proven in battles where quarter was neither asked nor given. When Norse mothers warned their children about the wild men of Alba, when Viking warriors chose easier targets than Scottish shores, when Norse sagas spoke of Gaelic warriors with the same tone they used for forces of nature, that was respect of the highest order. This legacy shaped Scottish martial identity for centuries to come. When Scottish regiments charged across battlefields from Culloden to Waterloo, from the Somme to El Alamein, they carried with them the inherited memory of ancestors who had stood against the most feared warriors of the medieval world and won. The pipes that played them into battle echoed with the ancient war cries that had frozen Viking blood. The fury they displayed in combat connected them to warriors who had made berserkers hesitate. Today, when you stand in the Scottish Highlands, perhaps you'll see them differently. These aren't just mountains and glens of extraordinary beauty. They're a landscape that tells a story of resistance, of violence meeting greater violence, of invaders learning that some peoples cannot be conquered. When the mist rolls in and visibility drops to mere feet, remember that this same mist once concealed Gaelic warriors who taught the Vikings the meaning of fear. The Highland mist still rises. It still conceals and reveals in equal measure. And somewhere in its grey depths, if you listen carefully, you might still hear the echo of Gaelic war cries and the clash of steel on steel. The sound of the day, the Vikings learned that even berserkers had something to fear. For in these mountains, they discovered a truth that popular history has forgotten. But the stones remember. There were warriors in this world who made even the Vikings afraid. And perhaps, in remembering this, we remember something essential about human nature itself, that no force, no matter how powerful, is truly unstoppable. That resistance, properly motivated and channeled, can achieve the impossible. That David sometimes beats Goliath not through divine intervention, but through sheer, unrelenting ferocity. The Scottish Gaels proved this truth with blood and iron, and their victory over the Vikings stands as eternal testimony to the power of those who refuse to yield. The Berserkers learned to fear the Highland mist, Perhaps it's time we learned why.